Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch. Every touch is a step forward. By Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom. By No Foods, No Grain, No Gluten, No Guilt. And by Audible. Listening is the new reading.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, calling the Endo in the middle of the night. Almost all of us have done it. But before you call the hotline again, you're going to want to hear this interview.
Any given night, we take care of 1,000 kids here at Rainbow Babies who have type 1 diabetes, close to just under 1,000. And so any given night, we may get 5 or 6 calls from families that have questions that come up in the middle of the night. So what I tell families is that that's part of our job, that we're on call 24/7. Diabetes doesn't sleep, right? Diabetes doesn't get a day off. Diabetes doesn't stop at 5 p.m.
Endocrinologist Jamie Wood shares the 10 things she's most commonly asked in the middle of the night. Plus, some new guidance on cell phone security when it comes to diabetes. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of Diabetes Connections. If you're a longtime listener, you know what we do around here. We aim to educate and inspire about type 1 diabetes by sharing stories of connection. If you are new to the show, thank you for giving me a chance. My name is Stacey, and my son was diagnosed right before he turned 2. He was 23 months old when he was diagnosed with type 1. My husband has type 2 diabetes. I don't have diabetes, but I have a background in broadcasting, local radio, and TV news, and that's how you get the podcast. And we just celebrated 3 years of the podcast this month. Really still getting over that. It's pretty wild to me. I hope we go on for many more years. So thanks again for tuning in. You know, this episode is one that I've wanted to do for a while. I really like talking to healthcare providers because I don't know about you, but I can never get enough time with mine. And he's great, and I can email him. I've seen him socially. He came to Benny's bar mitzvah. I mean, we've known him for more than a decade. But with doctors these days, they're so busy. And I always think of something when I'm not in the office. So calling that overnight hotline isn't something I've done in a long time, but I used to do it frequently. And it seems that, at least in my local Facebook group, I run a Charlotte area Facebook group for parents of T1D kids. And this is a topic that people really worry about. They worry about calling the doctor, right? Am I bothering the doctor? Am I asking too many questions? Is this a dumb question? Should I be bothering with that? And I think sometimes that they take to social media when it really is a doctor level question, right? So I was thrilled when Dr. Jamie Wood said yes to coming on the show. And we're going to get to that interview. She goes through the top 10 things she is asked in the middle of the night. And while most of this is about pediatrics because she is a peds endo, I think adults with type 1 can benefit from this as well. And I hope as you listen, I feel like I'm scolding you, but I hope even if you're an adult that you call the doctor when you have a question. And that this will help you maybe feel more comfortable to do so. Speaking of Facebook groups, please join ours, Diabetes Connections, the group. More and more is going on there. I'm thrilled with it. We're having fun doing polls, lots of good things, contests. And I have a contest coming up for Friends for Life, which is the big conference coming up in July. And all of the information for that is going to be in the Facebook group. So go ahead and check that out. Speaking of social media, though, you know, the way that podcasts are recorded, there's some time shifting here. There has been a lot of travel this month. And I have not been on social media as much as usual in the last 2 weeks. So if I missed you or if you commented and I didn't get right back to you, that is why. I should be back on by the time you hear this for a couple of days. I was actually out of the country. But as I said with time shifting, I haven't left yet. So hopefully all goes well and I have gone and come back and my luggage came back with me and I'm doing laundry. So I will, back in my house. So I will bring you up to speed on all of that in our travels and Betty at Diabetes Camp in next week's episode. Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And you know, the G6 should be out now, should be shipping for almost 2 weeks at this point. And we were so lucky to get the G6 a couple of weeks ago so we could try it out and let you know. As you know from listening to the show, Absolutely love it. But I'll tell you, we're really lucky. As I'm talking about endocrinologists this episode, we have a great relationship with ours, as I said. But using the Dexcom makes it all even easier. We used to keep logs. I mean, honestly, we kept logs for 6 months. I'm terrible at that stuff. But with the Dexcom G5 and now G6 mobile CGM system, you get that reading every 5 minutes and you can spot trends. You get a dynamic picture of blood glucose and then you can send the information through Dexcom Clarity. And that makes appointments a lot more productive because the doctor has more information. Managing diabetes is not easy, but I feel like we have one of the very best CGM systems working for us. Find out more about the G6. No finger sticks for calibration. No worries about Tylenol, acetaminophen. It's really good stuff. Check it out at diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. My guest today is Dr. Jamie Wood, an associate professor of pediatrics at Case Western Reserve University School of Medicine. She's the medical director of the diabetes program. Her bio says one of her favorite places to be is diabetes camp, so I'm already a fan. But I'm thrilled to talk to her and ask some parenting diabetes questions. Dr. Wood, welcome. Thanks for coming on with me.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
So one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you is that I've seen a presentation you've done in the past about common issues, why your phone rings as a pediatric endocrinologist in the middle of the night. And I can't wait to talk more about that because I think as parents, gosh, I remember calling so often to the Endo when we were first diagnosed. But let me just step back for a second and ask, why did you choose this as your specialty? What got you into diabetes?
It's actually a funny story. I was in medical school and was assigned a rotation in pediatric infectious disease and showed up for the rotation, and the infectious disease doctor had just gone out on a medical leave, and my rotation was canceled. So I asked, well, what do you have available for the next month? And they had an opening in pediatric endocrinology.
Wow.
So I rotated, wasn't planning on doing the rotation, and worked with a phenomenal pediatric endocrinologist up in rural Maine, in Portland, Maine, by the name of Jerry Olshan, who I was hooked. I went and spent a month with him, did outreach clinics with him, and it really was this 11-year-old little girl who was life-flighted into our hospital with newly diagnosed diabetes in severe DKA, and spent all night in the ICU with him helping to take care of her, and then the next 2 days in the hospital teaching her what she and her parents needed to know to manage diabetes. And then I was around for her first visit back to clinic. And I just said, this is it. This is what I want to do. I thought I was going to be a general pediatrician. I thought I was going to do general peds. And then I realized that I would have actually a more meaningful relationship with children and their parents by taking care of diabetes, because I get to see them more frequently, and I wanted that continuity in a relationship with a family. And then I got back from that rotation and I signed up my next elective to go to diabetes camp. And so I went to diabetes, and then I absolutely fell in love with diabetes camp, and I've gone every summer, I think, since then. I don't think I've missed a summer, and decided late in medical school that pediatric endocrinology was going to be my career.
I'm just curious, back to that 11-year-old girl in Maine, when she came back for her clinic visit after being diagnosed, I assume that was a couple of months later, usually it's about 3 months later. What was it like for you?
Actually, she came back, it was within a month, because the rotation was only a month. Well, it was, what I really appreciate about Dr. Olshan was that he said, you don't, as a medical provider, as a medical student, he knew that I really had no idea what it is like to live with type 1 or to take care of a child with type 1. So he excused me of all my responsibilities for the 2 days that she was in the hospital. I think it was probably closer to 3. And so I stayed with the family at their bedside for, I didn't sleep there, but from first thing in the morning to late at night. And I went through the training with the family. I got to a very close relationship with them. I spent 2 full days with them, just shadowing and listening and basically being educated myself about carb counting and about how to come up with insulin doses and how to treat lows and everything the family needed to learn, I learned. And so when they came back, it was fun because I had this relationship with them and I got to be quite bonded with the little girl. I still have the picture that she drew for me on my office wall. And it was a reunion of sorts. And it was also amazing to see the physical transformation from when I saw her in the hospital. She had lost a lot of weight. She looked obviously quite sick. She was very, very sick in the ICU. And to see her a month later, she'd gained all her weight back. She looked amazing. She had a smile on her face. And to see how quickly getting insulin back in her system helped, it was a lot of fun.
That's a great story. I mean, our endocrinologist I asked him, I'm terrible. We don't know each other very well, Jamie, but you don't want me as your patient. I'm the worst. I interviewed him, like it was his job when my son was diagnosed. But I asked him why he chose pediatric endocrinology. And one of his answers was he, as you said, he wanted the relationship with his patients, but he also wanted a practice where he felt he could make a real difference in quality of life. And you can see it in these kids when they come in and they are so sick, and then to treat with insulin. I can't even imagine as a parent, we were in the hospital for 3 days, to have that kind of support, somebody kind of learning along with you. That's a great story. And now here you are years later, helping parents like me. Can you talk a little bit about, this whole interview? The reason I really wanted to talk to you is to get this information about the on-call doctor. I think there's this mystery of sorts that we as a parent, we're so reluctant to call sometimes. Would you mind taking us through a little bit of what that really means for you? What are you doing when you're on call? How often do you have to do things like that? Open that curtain a little bit for us.
Sure. I suppose it is sort of a black box, and I think it also it highly depends on the center, on the practice. And I'm fortunate that I work at a major children's hospital in this country, and I have 8 other pediatric endocrinologists that I share the call responsibilities with. So, and I also have pediatric endocrinology fellows who are in training. We have 6 of them. So when I'm on call, it's for a shorter amount of time, and I have rests in between. But for me, I might be on call for a week straight out of every couple of months, and then I'll do 1 weekend every other month or so. And what that means is that I spend the day in the hospital taking care of patients, and then at night I go home with a pager on, and I tell my patients that we wear our pagers to bed. It is on my nightstand table, and then the fellow answers the call from the family, and then depending on the level of training of the fellow, if it's in their first year of training, they have to call with me with every question that they get to make sure that they are learning and they're giving the appropriate answer. And then as they get more experience, they'll call me if they have concerns. But not every program or not every pediatric endocrinologist is going to have a fellow, and so you may talk to the attending, the senior physician, as at the first conversation. But any given night, we take care of 1,000 kids here at Rainbow Babies who have type 1 diabetes, close to just under 1,000. And so at any given night, we may get 5 or 6 calls from families that have questions that come up in the middle of the night. So what I tell families is that that's part of our job, that we're on call 24/7. Diabetes doesn't sleep. Right? Diabetes doesn't get a day off. Diabetes doesn't stop at 5 p.m. So we know that the questions don't stop at 5 p.m. And so I spend time reassuring them that it's okay to call, especially the families going home with a new diagnosis. Something that may not be an urgent question is urgent to them.
I'm going to embarrass myself a little bit, but I'm almost proud of this as well. When my son was diagnosed, I called my endocrinologist's line. I didn't talk to him every day, but I called that office every day for a month, for 30 days straight. I had a 23-month-old. I had no experience with type 1. I was freaking out. They were fantastic. And then I called them on that 31st day just to thank them and say, I don't have a question today. And they cracked up. It was so funny. But I really felt bad at first, but they were so supportive. My questions were, as you can imagine, help me figure out this dose. There were no half-unit pens, so we were pulling things in syringes like quarter units. So they were good questions, but they were also really dumb questions, like I just injected myself by mistake. Or, I think I inhaled the insulin because I got some on my finger. I mean, I called for everything. But I know that not everyone is that comfortable. We'll find out how Dr. Wood wants to help us make that decision in just a second. Diabetes Connections is brought to you by One Touch, and handwriting your blood glucose levels is the ultimate throwback. The One Touch Vario Flex meter seamlessly syncs with the free One Touch Reveal mobile app to create your dynamic electronic logbook. And when you choose the One Touch Reveal mobile app, you'll be joining thousands of other people living with diabetes. In fact, as of this past October, One Touch Reveal was the #1 downloaded diabetes management app in the US, Canada, France, and the UK. To upgrade today to the One Touch Vario Flex meter and One Touch Reveal mobile app, visit diabetes-connections.com and click on the One Touch logo. Now back to Dr. Wood with her advice on when you should actually call.
I encourage them that the way to help them decide of whether or not to call, I go, do you need a piece of information or do you need a question answered in order to move on to what else you need to do? If you're frozen and you don't know what to do next, then that is a good enough reason to call. If you know that the answer to that question could wait until the next day, then write it down and call and ask that question the next day. Some families do have the misconception that we are on call at the hospital, awake, waiting for calls. So sometimes we'll get a call, even if it's in the middle of the night. My favorite call, I think, as a fellow was, I'm at a 24-hour CVS, and I just saw a new brand of meter that looks pretty cool. Do you mind calling me in one? At 3 a.m., right? So I'm like, that probably could have waited until the next morning. But so every once in a while we'll get a call that just the overnight it's for urgent issues, emergencies, questions that need to be answered, then and there. But I reassure them, and then sometimes we'll have to give a little gentle guidance, like, that call could have waited, but we're very understanding, and we also know that even if I know that question could have waited at that moment, the parent really needed it answered, and that's totally fine.
So let's talk about the questions that you get. The presentation that really caught my eye was the 10 most common questions you get in the middle of the night. I don't know if we'll go through all of them, but let's give it a try. What are some of the questions that you do find yourself answering when that pager goes off?
I'd say the most common are from newly diagnosed patients who are asking questions about bedtime blood sugars and questions about midnight blood sugars where they're not sure how to treat the low blood sugar or if they need the full dose of insulin. So I'd say probably the most common scenario would be, Joey's blood sugar at 9 o'clock at night is 65. Do I still give him his and then insert whatever long-acting insulin they're on? Lantus, Basaglar, Tresiba. Do I still give them their insulin? And the same sort of scenario, like blood sugars in the middle of the night, midnight, 3 a.m. blood sugars, where, say, for example, the blood sugar is not low, but it's sort of in the 80s or 90s. And should we wake them up to give them a little milk or give them a little juice, or should we treat that? So just, especially in the newly diagnosed, I think that is the most common. But I think the ones that are maybe not are as common, but I think I think every family probably will do it once or maybe twice in their experience living with diabetes, is when they mix up long-acting and short-acting insulin.
Oh, yeah.
So, for example, Emily was due for 15 units of Lantus at bedtime, and I swapped the pens by accident and just gave her 15 units of Humalog. What do? I'll get that call like once a weekend.
See, now I'm just going to jump in and say, I've seen that in a lot of the Facebook groups I'm in, and the person always seems to think they're the only person who's ever dumb enough to do that. And, you're not dumb. You're human. It happens.
Human.
Almost everybody has done that.
Well, and the pens, and now with the pens, they look very similar too. And so when you're busy, you're distracted, you're tired, you're sleep deprived, it happens. And one trick that I teach families is to pick one of the insulins, and I usually have them pick the long-acting basal insulin, is to take a bunch of rubber bands and coat the midsection of the pen with rubber bands. And your fingers, in a way, develop memory that when you pick up the Lantus pen and you feel those rubber bands on the pen, that you can associate that feeling with the Lantus, so that if you pick up a different pen, you're like, it's just another sort of trigger that you're not giving the right insulin. So or keeping them in different locations so that it's not as easy to mix them up, but it happens all of the time. And that's the first thing I tell them. Don't worry. I'm going to talk you through this. It's going to be fine. And then, and I give them instructions and then reassure them that just about everybody does this at some point.
I'm going to add here, we are not asking you to give us the medical advice that you would dispense over the phone, because obviously everybody is different. So with that
situation is different.
With that first question about bedtime blood sugars, I didn't even ask. Again, with this one, generally speaking, I would say ice cream party, but that's that's my advice, not as a non-medical professional.
No, that's exactly the advice. You figure out how much food that dose of Humalog would have covered, and you hit the ice cream.
Hey, just in general terms, though, would then you advise the parent to actually give the long-acting anyway?
I do, once you get through the active insulin time of the insulin that you gave. So just to make sure, I have them wait at least 2 hours to make sure that we're through the insulin time of that dose and that the blood sugar is coming back up. And it also depends on how big of a dose for that kid. And there's some times where I remember one call I got where a toddler was given, it was a different type of mistake. They gave just, instead of drawing up 2 units, the family drew up 20. It was they just drew up to the wrong line in the syringe.
Yep.
So that sort of dose discrepancy, 20 units in a 2-year-old, I'm like, we're not going to be able to eat enough.
Right,
right. So, my recommendation for that child was, you know what, I actually think I think we're going to need IV fluids to get us through this. So I want you to go in. And so, if without, and families know that, like, could I get my child to eat that much? And so if we haven't, no doubt, I'll also use mini glucagon to get us through that as well. But every once in a while, I'll have to, that's just too much. You have to go in.
Yeah, that actually happened to us very early on. The first week, we accidentally gave too much insulin to Benny. He was like 30 pounds. He was 27 pounds at the time because he had lost 3 pounds before the diagnosis. And I think we gave him 3 times as much, but it wasn't 20 units. So he was able to just drink a sippy cup of apple juice and be okay. But yeah, that was one of my calls. One of my many calls. What else?
Let's see if you did this next one.
Okay.
So I think probably it's pretty common is when a parent calls to say that they just realized that both parents gave the Lantus.
I don't think we did that, but I'm sure we have both dosed for a meal.
Yes. So it's really, one parent will go up and do the bedtime Lantus and then come down like, oh, just gave Tommy his Lantus. And then the mom says, so did I. And Tommy was asleep. So Tommy wasn't awake to say, hey, guys, you both just gave me Lantus. And so, what do we do? That's a really, really common scenario. And that is also a ice cream party of sorts, but that one lasts for 24 hours where you have to figure out how much long-acting insulin. So if you gave, for example, 8 units of Lantus, 8 extra units of Lantus, they'll need to have a little bit of free carb every 3 to 4 hours for the next 24 hours to cover that extra long-acting insulin.
Wow.
And so I can, with the family, would go through this how much extra they would need to eat at each meal,
right.
And or snack time, depending on what the long-acting insulin dose is and what their insulin to carb ratio is.
Yeah, definitely. We started a pump 6 months in, so we had other issues. Trust me, we messed up a lot, but we didn't do that one.
Or the next one is that they forget to give the long-acting altogether.
Oh, I've done that. Okay, guilty.
So that is a super common one, and especially if the bedtime blood sugar check is in target and they know they don't need to do a correction. It's just they're like, oh, we're good. We don't need to give any insulin, and then they forget to give the long-acting insulin, or it's just a hectic evening, and it just they were out late and doing something and they forgot, and so that is a pretty common scenario. But one thing that is nice, and this is an actual part where I need to sort of update this topic, is that the newer long-acting insulin on the market, Degludec, otherwise known as Tresiba, has a up to 3-day half-life, meaning that it is much more long-acting and is much more forgiving in terms of when you give it. For families that have a more hectic schedule in terms of, every day is not the same, they're not always, bedtime isn't the same, they find it would be helpful to give their long-acting insulin at different times of the day. That is a good choice of long-acting insulin for them. And so if you normally give long-acting at bedtime, but you were out doing something fun, you didn't get home until midnight, it's for Degludec, Tresiba, it's fine to give it then. That flexibility is very nice. But if you're on one of the other long-acting insulins and you forget to give the dose, the first step is the next morning is usually when people remember, is to check blood sugar. If the blood sugar is elevated, to check ketones, make sure, one, they're safe and they're doing okay. And then there's really two options. Some families choose to give the insulin, to give extra rapid-acting insulin every 3 hours and sort of cover that missed long-acting insulin until the next evening when the next dose would be due. That's sometimes hard to do at school, depending on the situation. So some families opt to give half a dose of the long-acting insulin in the morning and then go back to the fuller dose that night. I find that overlaps the basal too much, though, and doesn't work out so great. Then the third option is to give the full dose then, but then every day march back the dose by 3 hours until, in a couple days, until you get back to the normal time to give it.
Yeah, that's definitely a talk to your doctor, because everybody would handle that a little bit differently, I would think, especially depending on on activity that day and all sorts of stuff.
Exactly.
Wow.
And so that is, and that would be a very good reason to call your diabetes team. And it does. It depends on the individual circumstances. It depends on what they have planned that day. And so you have to individualize the solution to that problem. Number 5 is when a child is ill and they want to give an over-the-counter medication. And can Olivia have Tylenol? Can Olivia have Motrin? Can I give them a cough suppressant? And they'll read the back of the
I was just going to say that. It
box.
Always says something about diabetes.
It always says if they have diabetes to talk to a healthcare professional. And so we get that call a lot of the time. And the short answer to that is and I have a whole separate lecture that I love to give on sick day management. So we talk about this during that lecture as well. Being sick increases blood sugars for many reasons. One reason the blood sugars are increased is from discomfort and just, fever, feeling ill, feeling sick, just all of that increases your stress response and therefore increase your blood sugars. So even if there's a little bit of carbohydrate in the Tylenol suspension or the Motrin suspension, giving them the medicine so the fever comes down or the pain goes away will help the blood sugars. So the answer is yes. For sure, they can have Tylenol and Motrin. The one caveat to that is if they're using the Dexcom sensor, Tylenol interferes with the sensor and can give you artificially high numbers. So we advise that families use Motrin instead of Tylenol if they are on the Dexcom sensor. But the G6, the new version of the Dexcom, has Tylenol blockers in it. So hopefully that issue will be no longer for Dexcom users on the next generation. But there's some medications that definitely do not increase them a little bit, but actually can have a pretty significant increase for the blood sugars, and that would be inhalers. So children who have both diabetes and asthma, if they have an illness where they need to use their rescue inhaler, that can really increase the blood sugars. And so that is worth a call to the diabetes team to get a plan to handle that. Depending on the aged kid and depending on how much insulin they're on, I'll actually have the family bolus for when they give their child a breathing treatment and give them, an extra half a unit or an extra unit to curb that rise. And then the other scenario that most families are going to need extra help from their diabetes team if they have to be on steroids, like if they need prednisone or prednisolone for croup or for their asthma, that can markedly increase the blood sugars. And sometimes the insulin doses need to increase twofold. So that is not something that would alarm, that is definitely a question that the doctor would want to hear from you.
Yeah, you don't want to just do that on your own. We've dealt with steroids only once, luckily, and it is very difficult.
It's nerve-wracking to say, what, you want me to double their insulin dose? Yes, they will need it.
It's amazing I was just going to say, it's amazing how much they need it, because you think you're going to double it and then you're going to deal with lows. But with steroids, you get so excited to see anything, under 150. Under 200. I shouldn't laugh.
It's tough. Yeah.
But with the medication, and I'm not going to ask you to issue a blanket statement for every medicine, over-the-counter medicine at a drugstore, but that label of diabetics, call your doctor, in general terms, is that mostly for people with, higher A1Cs or for people with type 2? Is it really something that healthy kids with type 1 have to worry about?
No, typically not. That blanket statement is usually meant for adults living with diabetes for a long time who may have health-related problems related to diabetes. And it's also just giving you an alert that medication may increase the blood sugars. For example, one that is commonly asked are the decongestants, like the Sudafed and the pseudoephedrine ones. And those will increase the blood sugars for the same, because they have that agent, the pseudoephedrine or the ephedrine, will increase the blood sugars. And again, if it's going to make the patient feel better, that will help the blood sugars, and then you can they sort of counteract each other. But, for older patients with type 2 or type 1, giving somebody pseudoephedrine can raise their heart rate, and so they may have a cardiac problem. So it usually does not apply to kids living with type 1. Always worth checking out.
I know. What's next on your list?
I think another scenario is, we talked about the most common, which is, the blood sugar is low, and just questions about how much to treat and at what level to treat, which needs to be individualized. But the real common one is, especially for newly diagnosed families, the bedtime blood sugar is normal. Do we still need to give long-acting? And so just that concept that they need the long-acting insulin every day, and that long-acting insulin isn't meant to lower the blood sugar. It's meant to keep the blood sugar stable. So if they're heading off to bed with a blood sugar that's in target, yes, they still need to have their long-acting insulin. We'll be asked that if the blood sugar is low. If bedtime blood sugar is 65, do they still need to get their Lantus that night? Yeah. And yes, the answer is you treat the low. They may need to have some extra carbs at bedtime, depending on the situation. And yes, they still need to have their long-acting insulin. And if it's been a pattern, if it's something that keeps happening, then insulin doses probably need to be adjusted. And if I get this call, I'll ask some questions. Well, like, what have their numbers been when they've been waking up? And I'll ask a little probing questions. And sometimes I may say, well, it actually sounds like they might need a little bit less. But yes, they need it.
Yeah. Still got to take it. With the rubber bands on it, as per your advice.
Exactly. And then the next one is persistent highs. A common scenario is that this child's blood sugar is elevated at bedtime. They gave a correction dose for the high blood sugar. They rechecked them again at midnight, and they're still high. What should we do?
The answer is rage bolus. No, I shouldn't kid. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Rage bolus is a real thing.
Yes, we've talked about it here. Oh.
It is a real thing, and I'm seeing more rage bolusing now that more of my patients are using continuous glucose monitors, because I think you give a dose and you just don't see that curve turning back down.
All right, hold that thought. I shouldn't have jumped in with my bad joke, but hold that thought, because I want to talk to you about early adoption of CGM technology a little bit later on. But I'm so sorry to interrupt you. You gave me the real answer for the high won't come down.
The high that won't come down, that's one of the majorly important principles of sick day management. The first question is, does this happen all the time when the blood sugar is high? Do you find that when you give a correction dose of insulin, it doesn't come down to where we want it, and so maybe they need a bigger dose for that correction, is one question. But the most important question is there something else going on? Like, if this isn't a common thing, and are they sick? Are they coming down with something? Do they have a cold? And if you have 2 high blood sugars in a row, my rule of thumb is 2 blood sugars over 250 in a row. That's a situation where you want to check your ketones to make sure that you're doing okay. That's your check of, are we safe? Are we okay? And so if the ketones are getting moderate to large with 2 persistent highs, then that's a warning sign that they need more insulin, something else is going on. And for a family that's not experienced with that situation, that's a reason to call your diabetes team, even if it's in the middle of the night. Especially, for example, if they're on a pump, maybe it's a bad infusion site. Just going troubleshooting, are they sick? Are they on a pump? Could the insulin have gone bad? Is it a old vial that especially the little kids, and insulin is so darn expensive that families really hate to discard insulin that has been used over 30 days because the copays are so outrageous. And I will not get on that soapbox now, but it's a hardship for a lot of families to pay for insulin every month. And so they're throwing, especially a little kid who gets like 6 units a day of rapid acting, and you have to discard basically a full vial at the end of 30 days, that, making sure that they're using a fresh vial. And making sure that vial could not have been exposed to cold or heat. And sometimes if the blood sugars aren't responding, sometimes you just have to open up a fresh vial just to be sure. And then the other common scenario is a growth spurt, especially at that bedtime in overnight time, is when they're having a growth spurt and they're making lots of growth hormone. Growth hormone is made at night. It's not just an old wives' tale that you grow at night. It's actually true. You do. And that's when your body makes growth hormone, and that makes you resistant to insulin. And kids will have a growth spurt that lasts a week or 2, and then they can settle back down and then have another one. So they sometimes literally come down from breakfast and look like they've grown a centimeter, because I sometimes swear that they do. And so you often will need to maybe even temporarily increase the doses during that growth spurt. And you might have to lower them in another week or so.
I think my son has been going through a 13-year growth spurt. It is ridiculous. But I'm kidding, but he is, as you say, he'll grow a couple of centimeters before breakfast. It's ridiculous. But yeah, that's overtime adjustment has been a lot lately. Let's just put it that way.
And puberty's a whole nother podcast.
Oh yeah, let's not go there. Yeah.
So number 8 is a pump failure. The most common time for this call is first thing in the morning, when the child's first getting up in the morning and you're checking that first blood sugar of the day and you realize they're very high and perhaps they have ketones, perhaps they don't feel well, and they realize that something happened with the pump overnight. Or sometimes it's in the middle of the night and they realize that, for example, they'll put in a new infusion set at bedtime, which we don't recommend. We try to have the new infusion set put in earlier in the day, as late as dinner perhaps, so that you have another waking hour opportunity to check the blood sugar to make sure that infusion set is good. Because the most common time for an infusion set to go bad is when you first put it in terms of catheter kinking or something happening when you first put it in. So we get the call, they've already realized that the pump is broken, something's gone wrong, it's alarming, no delivery, it just is. I've had it drop in a toilet. I've had it run over by cars. I've had it, It's been lost in oceans, like just you name it, I've heard it. The end result is the pump's gone.
Wow.
What do we do? So our patients here at Rainbow, when they are on pump, they leave clinic with their backup plan. So if something were to happen to pump, and often sometimes it takes a couple days for the company to get you a new one. Sometimes it's the next day, but sometimes it depends on where you are and what's going on. But you need to know, every patient on a pump needs to know their backup plan for when there's a pump issue, in terms of how much long-acting insulin would they take. They have to basically revert to going back to shots, and if they've been pumped for 3 or 4 years, that Lantus dose that they used to take before the pump is no longer going to be enough. So when every patient that comes to see us, they leave with what would their Lantus dose be, or Basaglar or Tresiba or whatever they were on. What would their dose be if they were to have a pump failure?
That's a great question. It's also, one of the pieces of advice that we got was, obviously you want to write down your pump settings somewhere safe, but also to take a picture of them with your phone, because, I always have my phone with me. I don't always have my son with me. So sometimes if I have a question and the endo calls me back at an odd time, I can always just look at my phone. So that has helped me a great deal as well.
That's great advice. And we will actually photocopy their pump download at the visit and send them home with a copy of all of their settings.
Oh, that's great.
Because if the pump totally dies, you can't get back in there sometimes to see, well, what are the targets and the different basal rates and like all of the minutia. And so I try to give them their most recent download, and I send them home with a new one each time. And taking a picture of it is a fabulous idea, because then it could end up in a drawer somewhere and to be never found again.
Yeah, but I'm asking for a copy the next time we go. That's a great idea.
Yeah, I have had families use it all the time. Like, do you have your download from your last appointment? Oh yeah. And it saves a lot of time in terms of reprogramming the next pump when the next pump arrives.
Yeah, that's excellent. So let's go. We're almost there. Can we do 9 and 10? Are we going to run out of time, or can we go through them?
I think we can do it. 9 is a very common question of the child is sick, fever, sore throat, congestion, but blood sugars are doing okay and ketones are negative. Should I be doing anything different? And I think it's a theme that sick day management is a common question overnight. And so a lot of these are in the sick day management rules. And so the answer to this question is, 1, is there anything that we can do to make the child feel better? If there's fever control. If there's pain control. If it's an infection, treat the infection. Whatever the case may be, trying to identify the source and address it will help control the blood sugars. And then this is a good opportunity to say, just because things are okay now doesn't mean that you need to stop monitoring, that keep on checking the blood sugars more frequently than perhaps you would on a well day, and keep an eye on those ketones. And definitely check ketones if the blood sugars start going up over 250. And then I also teach families that even if the blood sugars are okay, especially in a gastrointestinal illness, that it's worthwhile to check the ketones even if the blood sugars are still in the hundreds, just to make sure that they're getting enough carb and we're keeping those ketones at bay.
Yeah, and I only know this from my experience, unfortunately, over the years, you've got to keep that insulin going even when they're sick and not eating anything, or you can get ketones pretty easily, right?
Exactly. Right. And they're called starvation ketones, and someone without diabetes will get them too. And if we're not getting carbohydrate for energy for whatever reason, because we're not eating it or because we're not getting enough insulin, our bodies will make ketones. So when there's a gastrointestinal illness and the appetite is down and they're not getting enough carb in, the ketones can develop. And so letting them sip on a little, it's one of those days where, sip on some Sprite or ginger ale or, something that has carb in it if they're not eating, and that will help keep the ketones away.
Great. And number 10, our last question overnight.
The number 10 is the least common question I get asked. but it made the top 10 because it is the question that parents worry about the most, which is, Annie's very low. I can't wake her up. They taught me how to give glucagon in the hospital, and I can't remember. What do I do? I've had this call. I've been a pediatric endocrinologist for 15 years or more than that now, and I have had to talk through, I think, 2 families. It's a rare question, right? These are not common events, but it's, I think, important enough that I wanted to put it in the top 10 because it's what I think the parents worry about the most. So I add it to it so that I have the opportunity to go through what you would do. And I think it's important. Everyone has glucagon kits, and everyone was trained on them in the beginning. And most families don't have to use them. But when they do have to use one, if they have to use one, it may be years down the road. And most families don't remember. So what I teach families to do is you have all of these kits that you never use and they expire. Before you throw it away, practice mixing it up and practice giving it to an apple or an orange or a mattress or whatever, and so that you've gone through it. And so every year or so, and hopefully you won't need to use it, but you've practiced it. You've kept that skill sharp. It's one of those things that families I know worry a lot about. And so having that skill and having practiced it a few times, if the scenario were to come up, they feel more confident.
I am glad to hear you say that it's a rare occurrence. I am always happy to talk more about glucagon training, and we definitely need to know how. But you said 2 times in 15 years you've taken that call?
Yeah, it's not, and sometimes families will just, they'll call 911 and not do the glucagon because they don't remember or they don't feel confident doing it, which is also fine. That's a fine thing to do. But severe lows requiring glucagon in the middle of the night are for a center like ours who takes care of, close to 1,000 patients, it's not a common scenario. Nighttime is the more common time of the day. We do know that from clinical research that severe lows tend to happen more so overnight than during the day. But with that said, they're still relatively uncommon.
Several minutes ago, we started to talk about early adoption of diabetes technology, things like CGMs and pumps. And I know that, at least in my community, more and more people are getting these devices sooner than in years past. In fact, I believe Dexcom has a pilot program in my region where they're giving people a Dexcom CGM before they're discharged from the hospital. So I'd love to get your take on, look, I don't know if it's good or it's bad. I do know it's coming. I do know that more and more people are doing this regardless. What's your advice for families that start this before they even really understand diabetes?
I think this is an unanswered research question, and I think it needs to be studied because I think the jury is still out, to be honest. I have been doing this a long time, and sort of back in the day, you often didn't get an insulin pump until closer to a year of diabetes duration. You would really rarely before 6 months. And still, some insurance companies still to this day will not authorize an insulin pump until the child's had diabetes for 6 months. Now, I don't understand it. I think that's wrong, and I fight it on a daily basis to get children pumps earlier if they want. But I think this is something that really, really needs to be individualized. And I think there is a lot of pressure from online communities and Facebook groups and that, they need a Dexcom right away, they need a pump right away. And the family may do very well with that, and they may benefit from that. But some families need longer to just settle into having a child with diabetes, sort of emotionally and psychologically, and also learning the basics. I feel that if a family hasn't mastered sort of the basics of diabetes management in terms of calculating doses and basic managing diabetes with injections, that going too quickly to a pump can be detrimental. And especially if every family accepts the diagnosis differently, grieves differently, and some are, all right, we've got diabetes, we're going to take charge, they just full steam ahead, let's get a sensor, let's get a pump. And some families need to just take a step back and say, you know what, we just need to live this for a while, we need to regroup, we need to take our time to learn what the options are. And I think the answer is the right answer is different for every family. And then I have some, especially kids who are diagnosed in their tween years and maybe even into their teenage years, that just don't want technology yet. I have actually a very close friend whose daughter was just diagnosed at the age of 12. And this family's on it. I mean, they're doing great. They've moved on. She's back to doing everything in a very, very short amount of time. And I said, hey, how about a pump? She runs track. I'm like, I think it would be really helpful to get her on a pump. And she's just like, no, I don't want anything on my body. I don't want a pump. I know what they are. You've shown me a pump 10 million times. Stop. Bring it up. I don't want it. So you also have to take into account the child's perspective on it. So short answer is I talk about the options in the beginning in just sort of very general terms, not here's 10 different pamphlets of different options, read them, tell me what you want. But just those first couple months, these are the options. If you want to hear more, I'll give you all of the information, and then we individualize it. And every family's different.
Yeah, I agree. And, it's very interesting to see how it's changed so quickly from having to wait a long time for all of these things to, as I said, in the hospital to get a continuous glucose monitor. So we'll be watching it. I'd like to see some studies on it too. I think that would be very interesting.
Well, I just saw a patient yesterday in clinic, and it was a rather pretty newly diagnosed, and she had just started on a Dexcom, and so we had 1 week's worth of Dexcom data at the appointment. And so I had her blood sugar meter with 6-7 blood sugars a day, and then I had the 1 week worth of Dex. And I was looking at the blood sugars first from her meter, and I said, oh, it looks like she needs more Lantus. Oh, looks like she needs, I had kind of in my mind come up with a couple of dose adjustments. And then I looked over to the Dexcom report, and it told a very different story.
Yeah.
And so I think, especially maybe not pump, but I think the Dexcom, the data that we get from a continuous glucose monitor is really valuable, and sometimes will tell a slightly different story than when you're just looking at the numbers. So I think the field is moving to more early adoption of especially the continuous glucose monitoring.
I do too. I just hope that there is more education always with it. The fear, I'm not saying this is happening. I'm a big fan of Dexcom. They are a sponsor of the show. But I worry that, and I see this in my local Facebook group, that they get the monitor and they have absolutely no idea what it means. Nobody realizes how slow insulin is. People aren't educated in what they're looking at. It's just one of these things where it's such a great tool. But I do think it scares people to see all the information right away without the education.
The box arrives at the door, and we say, watch a YouTube video.
Yeah, right.
And families do, and we're part of, here at Rainbow, we're part of a multi-center trial called the SENSE trial, which is using the Dexcom CGM in children under the age of 8 and looking at the effectiveness of a behavioral intervention in terms of supporting young kids and parents, as well as a training program. And it's been teaching families how to use it. I don't know, shouldn't be surprising, right? Helps, right? And I think if you don't tell them, like, you are going to, once you start seeing the numbers on the Dex, you're going to see that post-meal spike that you're not used to seeing.
Right. That's what happened to us. Yep.
And your instinct is, in an hour, your instinct is, God, I got to give them a correction. But then, and then we touched on the rage bolusing, and this isn't exactly rage bolusing, but just that I'm not used to seeing a 200 or a 220 an hour after a meal or higher if it's breakfast, and giving it time to come back down the other side and learning from that pattern before just going ahead and correcting it. So I think that education of how to use the data is really important.
That's great stuff. Well, before we get too further sidetracked, let me bring it back to calling your endo, because you've been a huge help with that. What is your advice if people are picking up the phone at 2 a.m., they're picking it up, they're putting it down, they're not sure, right? What would you say? I mean, are you angry when your pager goes off?
No, I mean, I get tired. If it's been, especially this flu season was a doozy. And I do get tired, and I may not be all like chipper and uppy, and I may sound tired, but I 100% never get angry. And I think when you call, it's going to help to be prepared for the phone call, have sort of your ducks in a row. And, if have your blood sugar log sort of in front of you, like the recent blood sugars. If they're sick, already check your ketones, like check the ketones. Sometimes the family will call with a high blood sugar in the middle of the night, and I'll be like, so what are the ketones? I'm like, oh, we haven't checked yet. Check the ketones. And so you have that piece of information before you call so that it can be efficient. And you don't have to have okay, I'll have to call you back with that information. And there are certain things that 100% you should never, ever hesitate to call. If they're sick and the ketones are moderate or large and you're not sure what to do and it's a scenario you haven't dealt with before, that always deserves a call. If they have signs of diabetic ketoacidosis, so if they're vomiting, if they're having abdominal pain, if they're breathing fast or breathing funny, if you can smell ketones on them, you can just smell them on their breath, that's a reason to call. If you're having lows, persistent lows that you're having a difficult time treating, call. So those sort of scenarios, do not hesitate. And then the other ones, just ask yourself the question, is this something that can wait until the morning, or is there a piece of information that I need right now in order to make a decision about what is the next best step? And if that's the case, especially if you're a new family, don't hesitate, call.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for sharing this information, for spending so much time with me. I know it's very helpful, and I hope that the next time, someone hears this, they don't hesitate to pick up the phone the next time that they have a question that really needs to be answered in the middle of the night. Thank you so much for spending some time with me.
You're very, very welcome. This was a lot of fun.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
As she said, that's a presentation she does at different conventions and conferences. So if you see the 10 things in the middle of the night from Dr. Wood, definitely go check it out. And I hope that gives you the confidence to call, knowing that your endocrinologist really isn't bothered by it. If it's a regular question, as she said, not which meter should I buy tomorrow? But I also hope it gave you pause as to whether to call for those types of situations, right? So be thoughtful, of course, be a good person about your endo's sleep, but also don't hesitate if you need it. That is what they are there for, especially with newer diagnosed families. They get it. They really do understand. And if they don't, all right, should they really be in the business of medicine? I don't think so. So call them if you need to. That's the bottom line. In our Know Better segment this week, security guidance for mobile phones that control diabetes devices. We'll tell you about this in just a second. Know Better is brought to you by Know Better Foods. No grain, no wheat, no gluten. I don't have any soy or dairy, no peanuts, no yeast, and no guilt. They make these delicious foods, muffins and bagels and bread. I had the bread slices yesterday with a little peanut butter on it. Delicious. They make them with chia, flax, coconuts, almonds, and egg whites. And it's really good stuff. And I have to tell you something. My family, bunch of weirdos, do not like coconut. That's like a big thing in my house. Oh, coconut. Blah, blah, blah. I love coconut. And they were concerned that they would taste the coconut in the Know Better foods. In fact, I didn't want to tell them it was even in there, but it's right on the label. You don't taste the coconut. You don't feel the coconut. It's not that at all. So if that's holding you back, my poor family. But they're a bunch of weirdos. Who doesn't like coconut? If that's holding you back, don't worry about it. You don't taste it at all, especially with the waffles, the chocolate chip waffles. So good. They just taste like waffles. Find out more. Go to Diabetes-Connections, click on the No Foods logo, and use the promo code Stacey10 to save at checkout. I learned recently about something called DTS. This is the Diabetes Technology Society. It's a nonprofit group, and they are all about promoting development and use of technology in diabetes. They put on scientific conferences, and they get scientists and researchers come to these. This isn't really an open to the public kind of family conference. They put out a press release recently, and I'll link this up at diabetes-connections.com and in the show notes. They have a new consensus cybersecurity standard. And the goal here is to basically provide assurance that your mobile phone will safely control diabetes devices. Really important, because take a step back for a minute. Right now, mobile phones don't control any devices. You can see some data on your phone, but the next generation of devices are planned with your phone as the controller. Bigfoot Biomedical comes to mind initially, where they have an insulin pump and no controller, because your controller will be on your smartphone. That's the first one that comes to mind, but I know that many, if not all, of the pump companies that you can think of are working on the same thing. Dozens of companies already have mobile apps, but it's the smartphone as the controller, right? It's beyond the Dexcom Share and the Follow. It would be, I click on my phone and I take insulin. So that's a huge deal. Very, very different. One of the committee chairs for this organization is also the head of security for Android, Chrome, and Play at Google. And he is talking about how we need more visibility into and assurance for security. Insulet had some statements on this as well. They are looking forward to more digital diabetes innovations, as they say, and they talk about this guidance providing a cybersecurity blueprint. So there's a lot going on here. I'll link it up. This isn't a law. This isn't going to change anything today on your cell phone, but it's really important stuff as we look at their laying the groundwork for what's going to come in the years ahead. And now you know better. This month, we started partnering with Audible. I'm a huge fan of listening to books, and Audible is offering a free audiobook download with a free 30-day trial to my listeners. You can just check out their service, see if you like it, grab a book, and go on your way. It's so easy. Go to diabetes-connections.com, click on the Audible logo, go to the show notes. I've got it in the Facebook group and all over social media. You have 180,000 titles to choose from, and this works with iPhone, Android, Kindle, or an MP3 player. If you're already listening to podcasts, you're going to love audiobooks. Hey, do me a favor. I've scrolled through the titles. I'm looking for some of the diabetes books that are out there, biographies, the stories of the discovery of insulin and the history of Banting and those kinds of things. Haven't found anything on Audible yet. If you do, please let me know. You can drop me a line, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com, or just post in the Facebook group or, on social media. I'm curious about that because the books I've listened to from Audible have been mostly nonfiction memoirs. Those are my favorites right now. But I'd love to hear more about diabetes. It'd be interesting to see if there are good books out there that I could recommend. So let me know. Thanks, as always, to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. As I had stated earlier, traveling a lot. So getting him these episodes has been quite the adventure. Thanks, John, for all you do. Very much appreciate it. Thank you for listening. We have fun things coming up. The scientific sessions of the American Diabetes Association conference is just around the corner, and I'm not going there, but I do have interviews lined up with some of the pump makers to follow up on announcements they are planning to make, so please stay tuned for that. And then we will be off to Friends for Life, and you never know what kind of news is going to pop up there. So I'll do my best to keep up with it and bring all the news I can to you. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.